Hi, everybody. My name is Nusha Rashidian. I'm the co-founder of Cannabis Wire. We're a news organization that covers the global cannabis industry. Thanks for joining us today to talk about how to launch a successful niche digital media product. Today we have with us Sarah Frank. Sarah is the editor of NowThis, which is home to NowThis Weed. And we also have Ricardo Baca, who is the editor of The Cannabis, which is part of the Denver Post. So the niche we'll be talking about today is cannabis, in case you haven't noticed. And that's not just because we're in Colorado, though I think that is a good reason to be talking about it. I've been covering this issue for about 7 years now, and it is a tremendous source of really rich editorial. And now that it's at the heart of a booming industry, we're finding, the three of us in other newsrooms, that it's a source of potential revenue as well. So for those of you who are new to the cannabis landscape, I'll give you a really quick overview. Today, there are 4 states and Washington, D.C. that have completely legalized cannabis for adult use. Half the country allows it for medical use, more than half the country actually. And this state alone, Colorado, as Ricardo knows, is on track to hit $1 billion, billion, not million, $1 billion in sales of legal cannabis this year. I have a feeling that O&A will be contributing to that somehow, just saying. So I wanted to show you guys a little bit of the publications that we'll be talking about today, just so you have a visual as the panelists are talking. So this is NowThis Weed. As you can see, it lives on Facebook and primarily publishes videos, actually only publishes videos. And these videos, if you look down at the bottom, you'll see get tremendously high views. The Facebook audience loves weed. And here we have the cannabis. So even though the cannabis is part of the Denver Post, you'll notice that it's a standalone site. It's not a vertical, or it's not Denver Post / cannabis. It lives by itself. There was also a new cannabis show that Ricardo's launched that he'll talk about, I'm sure. And finally, this is Cannabis Wire. This is my publication. I wrote a book about cannabis legalization a few years ago, and this was a way to stick with the beat. And this is a resource page that we've launched, by the way, for those of you who might want to get into cannabis journalism. It's cannabiswire.com/starter kit, and it pretty much will get you up to speed on everything you need to know about the cannabis beat. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I want to start with Sarah Frank here. Why did NowThis decide to launch NowThis Weed?
Yeah, just before I answer that, I just wanted to know how many of you guys live and work as journalists in one of the states where cannabis is either legal for recreational use, medical use, decriminalized, or some other,
Wow.
Okay, wow, actually, that's great. And how many of you guys have had like newsroom or maybe section-based conversations about how to cover cannabis as a beat or as an issue? Okay, cool. So probably those people who raised their hands had a similar experience that we had, which is NowThis is primarily is a distributed media platform that primarily lives on Facebook. We're always kind of covering marijuana legalization, decriminalization, and medical cannabis, and really quickly realized that we had a passionate audience about these issues, and every story that we did typically would overperform or perform just at this like rate that there were so many stories that we wanted to cover, but we really didn't want to overpower our main feed and just be like 4 or 3 cannabis stories per day, because there were so many stories nationwide that were happening constantly across all of these issues. It touches business, it touches criminal justice reform, it touches products, entertainment, all of these things. So we decided we would launch a page about a year ago, and now we're approaching about 1 million followers. And really what has made that page successful is it's a passionate audience, there's a lot of news, and we have a point of view, which our point of view is like not too serious, not too stoner. It's kind of right in this middle landscape where we're not typically reviewing strains in the way that High Times, used to or still does a lot. But we also weren't taking this like hardline investigative angle. We were just covering the natural things that the people in our office and their peers were talking about when it came to marijuana legalization in a variety of forms.
What about you, Ricardo? Why did the Denver Post, not just, as Sarah said, flood the page with cannabis coverage when cannabis was legalized in 2012? Why did they say, let's make this its own thing?
Yeah, welcome to Colorado for one, but we voted at the same time as Washington State to legalize this recreationally. We implemented it about 5.5 months before Washington State, and so as that implementation date was approaching, January 1st, 2014, the editor of the Post at the time, Greg Moore, was having conversations with everybody about how do we cover this, and he just had the epiphany that this needs to be covered like any other beat. We need to stop covering it like marijuana and the way we'd always approached it, but this is suddenly a legal substance to anybody 21 and over. So let's get over that stigma, let's move forward, let's do serious journalism, let's do serious criticism, and let's have some fun with it as well, approach it from a cultural perspective and what this means as an impact on our daily lives here in the first place to implement these sales in the modern world. So that was a big part of it. Certainly, we've gotten the calls from readers who are tired of seeing marijuana on the front page of the Post, and I'm sure that played into Greg's decision ultimately to move forward with a standalone site. And when they approached me, it was important to me that this site stand completely on its own, because I'd started a music blog and a music festival at the paper as well, and of course, the Denver Post name carries a lot of goodwill in the community, but it's also good to get outside of that to kind of escape some of the confines of daily journalism and so many of the stigmas that have been attached to this substance and the journalism surrounding this substance, whether that journalism was coming from a perspective of activism or, criminalism.
So I want to talk a little bit about editorial strategy for both of you. So, I take the view that it's not enough anymore to just say you cover cannabis. I think that people are starting to and will continue to segment off what aspect of cannabis they talk about. Like you said, there's business, there's the criminal justice aspect of it. We at Cannabis Wire, we chose industry and global industry. That was our choice. At NowThis Weed, you said that you cover politics, products, and policing. So, take me into the room where those conversations happen, where you said this is our scope.
Well, currently it's a Slack room. No, but when it started early on, we were really looking for the stories that we had an emotional resonance to. When we were kind of seeing something pop up based on a feed or a subreddit or a Google alert where we were actually reacting to it, like, this is amazing, like, this is so fucked up, this is crazy. When we were having that reaction, so like the weed stuck in the carrots, which was a very successful story, or the man who makes honey infused with weed, or the honeybees make the weed. Honeybees make the honey from weed blossoms, sorry. All of these things made us react, but they wouldn't have necessarily all fit into a proper tagline that's like all the news you need to know about weed, like, right? That wouldn't have necessarily fit in. So we started from an authentic place of stuff that we're actually interested in. So it wouldn't just be business. It wouldn't just be, very legislation-focused stories. There were to be a range of emotion with these stories, right? There'd be the kind of stories that would make you laugh and tag your friends. There'd be the kind of stories that would make you angry and share it. So for us, that was what was most important, is that we thought our users, and I think it's been proven, that they wanted to have a variety of conversations about cannabis. So what really surprised me from the beginning was there wasn't one type of subtopic within the genre that overperformed against the other ones. So like sometimes our audience is obsessed with big pharma's influence on the cannabis industry. Sometimes it's medical cannabis for kids. Sometimes it's like these crazy vaporizer products. Like it varies widely. And I think it actually is that it's finding a different subset of the audience, these stories.
What about you, Ricardo?
We cover a much broader perspective. I think everything from Denver City Council to the Colorado State Legislature to the California State Legislature and what's happening in Washington, Oregon, Alaska. thanks to our partners, our wire services, we subscribe to the Washington Post wire service and benefit greatly from the writing of Christopher Ingraham, who is a hero in data journalism. But I think it's all important, and it was always important to me to have a breaking news story next to an investigative report, next to a review of a new vaporizer. This readership, I learned very quickly, is discerning, intelligent, absolutely undeserving of this stigma that's been placed upon them for decades, and very aware. They like the fun stuff, sure, they like the cultural reporting, but I was just blown away at how many of my friends who are self-described stoners here were absolutely aware of medical legislation happening on the East Coast, CBD-only legislation happening in the American South. And so they were that aware and that cognizant of everything happening in this space. We really cover this as a national story intentionally. I've never viewed the Cannabis as a local website, and it's taken some struggling with our ad department to make them realize that this is not a local website. We have more readers in California than we do Colorado. We have more readers in Texas than we do Colorado. That's our top three: California, Texas, Colorado. Very proud of that, and hoping to welcome other states into that mix.
So you both said that, you strive to sort of have a little bit of fun with the topic, and I think that there is a tendency to be really lighthearted. And I wanted to talk to you guys about sort of what the boundaries are. Where do you draw the line around having fun with cannabis? BuzzFeed recently did a video, I know, about, high people try 90 snacks. And it was, 3 people sitting there, 2 people sitting there, clearly stoned, eating snacks. I mean, I'm sure got a lot of views. Is that something that you guys would consider doing? Or do you guys have these conversations where you're like, you know what, no high people here, no, know this, know that?
I would guess that those BuzzFeed producers were in California. I don't know, but that's been something that we've talked a lot about, and we talked about a week or 2 ago about when you think about making a portion of your cannabis coverage just showing that you're stoned, or thinking about, talking while stoned or interviewing while stoned. There's a fun video podcast called Getting Dug with High that is much more enjoyable if you as a viewer are also stoned. But there are legal implications as a journalist about knowingly breaking the law on video and things like that. And also, it was really important for us to elevate the conversation. As Ricardo said, like, the audience who follows NowThis Weed and who's engaged, they're really smart, and they want more information about the issue that they're passionate about. If they wanted to see people try 90 snacks while high, they would probably just invite their friends over. So I would say that maybe that's not the most gratifying content.
I mean, it's a difference between like journalism and entertainment, right? And BuzzFeed is pretty masterful at how they straddle that. I have a talk show. It's weekly. It's also released as an audio-only podcast on iTunes. Hit subscribe if you like weed. But we are more about journalism than entertainment. And if it's ever entertaining, great. But we're just approaching it from that perspective of this is journalism first, And speaking of that stand-up comic that Sarah just mentioned, Doug Benson, he's one of the heroes in this culture, and he's become a friend of the cannabis, and we're thankful for that. Some independent filmmakers made a movie about me and my team called Rolling Papers, and it's on Netflix now if you get the chance to see it. It played in theaters earlier this year. But Doug saw it at South by Southwest when it had its world premiere, was a fan, talked about it a lot on both of his podcasts, had me on his podcast, which is called Doug Loves Movies. And that makes sense because it's kind of a fun thing. It's not my product. We could go and have a good time and talk about it. But then one of his next trips through Colorado, he was recording his first ever non-California episode of Getting Dug with High, which is where Doug just gets blasted with his guests and rambles. And, they were doing it in a public venue, and as you might have heard, we still haven't figured out public consumption laws here in Colorado, and I couldn't knowingly be a guest on a theater stage with this comic and get high, knowing that I was breaking the law, just because we're journalists. We have ethics, and that's a good thing, and so I had to politely decline, and we typically side on the side of journalism. Let's just do this. And if it's entertaining, like one of our pot critics, his name is Jake Brown, he's a very creative writer and a very experienced stoner and an intelligent man, and I highly encourage you to go check out his reviews on the cannabis, because I think think they do a good job at representing what we do. It's legitimate newspaper ethos criticism with a good time in the mix.
So, I'm curious how much you both struggle with the new terminology that's sort of come out as part of the new industry. I remember you and I were talking a little bit about the decision to be marijuana editor versus cannabis editor. And so I want you to talk a little bit about that and why terminology carries so much weight.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when they first announced this position, the Boston Globe called, I think they have a language writer, and she wanted to talk specifically about nomenclature and how we landed there. And it was honestly a conversation with our copy chief and our editors for a good month before we settled on marijuana editor because, as many of you likely know, it's a controversial slang term, Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever reason, all of Colorado state law is written about recreational marijuana. You have recreational, you have retail, you have adult use, you have marijuana, you have pot, you have cannabis, you have weed, a million others. And because of that reason, we're a newspaper covering the state-regulated industry, and we're going to use the terminology that the state uses. A lot of cannabis activists aren't fans of that. I have two people who comment on so many of my things every single time saying the same thing. You should not call it marijuana. It is cannabis. Marijuana is a racist term. And this is an ongoing conversation that we're having, especially as other states continue to legalize and regulate this substance. I mean, 9 more states are voting on this in November. Less than 2 months from now, we're going to know what's happening in California, Nevada, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Maine, and many other places. So that's kind of how we handled it inside the newsroom.
What about you, Sarah? Was this a conversation you guys had?
It's sort of an ongoing conversation because what's important to us is that our users understand, like, if it's happening in their state, they might have some additional press that they're interacting with. But if you're a Now This Weed follower who lives in Florida and you're interested in what's going on in Maine, I think it is important to remind people subtly, I mean, we do it in giant, big text, is this state decriminalizing, recreational, retail, medical, I mean, all of the different nuances. And so we do often break down in our pieces, like, this would mean this would happen to you if you did this, or you would be able to carry this if you were this old, like just very plain language, because it does vary state to state. It does, oftentimes we'll just use the shorthand of legal weed, in headlines and things to just kind of bring people into the conversation and then get into the details later.
And these details are increasingly important when you think about it, because a nug here doesn't mean anything, but that could mean jail time in Louisiana or somewhere else. So I think the education aspect of this beat is something that we've taken very seriously, and I think that has to be explained very carefully and taken seriously so the readers understand exactly what's going on if they didn't already.
Yeah, I mean, the Denver Post did something really interesting with one of your stories where, so as to not weigh down the text, and I think this is a unique, topic that requires certain creativity in how you develop your website. You guys had it so you had this little, you could hover over a word and it would give you the definition above it. That was for one article, but we've started to implement that in our own site because after a while it gets tedious to say, by the way, 20-some state, you kind of need to just get to the story, but there's a lot of context behind it. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, Sarah, about what it was like to establish the Now This Weed brand on Facebook. How to launch it, so how to establish a brand new brand on a platform.
Yeah, I think honestly it was easier than we expected because we already had this passionate audience. So we, just took all of the stories that we were already doing, added a few more each day, and really kind of tried to cut out pitches that we felt like weren't in line with our tone. So anything that was like overly fearful of weed, we would stray away from. That was more of a tone and voice conversation. So when we would do stories about like, oh my gosh, children are eating weed gummy bears, we would really try to put in context like where this is happening, and we would try to show them next to each other. So it was less of just a fear of weed and more of like, well, this company made their product look identical to those little peachos. Something that would be more authentic to what the conversation our users would actually have with their friends, and not like weed candy is bad. So that was important to kind of figure out the lane that our stories lived in.
And how has that changed since you launched?
I would say it hasn't actually changed too much since we've launched. I guess our users have probably gotten more informed and more engaged, so we can kind of notch up a few. Like this week, we actually partnered with Reveal, the Center for Investigative Journalism. They did a piece about sex trafficking within these like kind of backwoods, Emerald Triangle. And so that was a partnership that we did where we basically made a video version of their long investigative report. We did like a short version to their podcast, and that was actually one of the first pieces that we shared on Now This Weed that was getting a lot of negative attention because it was like, this is anti-pop propaganda, and we were trying to show the story of like, it's not all, I mean, this isn't about marijuana being bad, but there are some like not great things that come with being underground in some states and legal in other states. This is some of the stuff that comes with it. So I think that's a piece that we wouldn't have done week one. You know, it's really about kind of elevating that conversation now, and I think definitely as it gets closer to the election, you'll see the conversation evolve a little bit more about voting and what's on the ballot and what specifically, like what's problematic language on these ballot measures. So we'll get a little bit more detailed and highbrow about some specific things.
And that brings up a fun and necessary part of this conversation, because High Times, 42 years old, very important in this national conversation, international conversation. But at the same time, I spent more than a year with one of our newsroom's investigative reporters looking into illegal pesticide use in the marijuana industry here and in other states. And we led reporting, and we fed off what the Oregonian was doing. And you know, that's something that High Times never touched in that time, and they're not going to touch because it does put the industry in a negative light. And daily, we're combing through story ideas, freelancer submissions, and also our wires. And I can tell you straight out, I know this story is not going to perform well, and I know this one will. We still need them both up there, because from our perspective, this is journalism, the good and the bad. It doesn't matter about proposed, what we think about is going to happen in the traffic scheme once these things are posted. It's just necessary to tell the whole picture.
And I'm curious, for the cannabis, you know, how much did being affiliated or part of the Denver Post help with, you know, establishing the cannabis brand, and how much do you think it maybe confused people? How was it to sort of differentiate and say, no, this is, you know, we're not the Denver Post, but we are part of them?
Yeah, I don't think it's confused anybody. It's pretty clear. You know, if you go to the bottom of the page, it says the Denver Post. A lot of our bylines are Denver Post. We've seen a lot of successes in our time at the cannabis, almost 3 years. And 2 months ago, we were, I believe, 150,000 monthly uniques right behind High Times, you know, which is fantastic because they have 40 years on us, and we're just a little startup. but we have lots of gumption, and we're passionate about it. And I think, you know, the Denver Post brand, 9 Pulitzers, whatever, it carries a certain credibility, and I've always shared any of our successes with the newsroom because we really piggyback off the great reporting. You know, the cannabis doesn't have somebody inside every Denver City Council meeting. We don't have 2 people inside the state legislature every day of the session, but we benefit from those Denver Post reporters, and that's really what's boosted us up to this place. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship, because now the cannabis can come in and kind of corner this market share and create a brand that's not the stodgy old newspaper that has written many anti-marijuana editorials over the years, including against recreational and against decrim and against medical. And now we can kind of start anew and say, let's have a sane conversation in this space, and we still run a very clear majority of the Denver Post content, including editorials.
So, Sarah, you know, you get a lot of, I'm assuming, very rich analytics from Facebook. So, you know, what have you found as far as your audience? Like, who is your audience? Who reads Now This Weed?
It's pretty typical of our other Facebook pages, which is it's about 75% under 35, and it skews a little bit more male. It's about 55, 45 male. And that's pretty standard across all of our pages. Sometimes some stories are a little more male than female, and it's sometimes hard to determine why, but, and they're predominantly in the US, Mexico, and Canada.
Wow. And what about you, Ricardo? What would you say that your audience mirrors that?
It's very similar, yeah. In terms of the gender breakdown and age, yeah, I think our number one readership is millennials, and then, a lot of boomers, a lot of senior citizens. A big focus in America, I mentioned the states, Texas, California, Colorado, as well as lots going on in Canada. Lots going on in Scandinavia for whatever reason, and the UK is very interested as well. I've been down, I've reported in Morocco and Uruguay, specifically on what's happening marijuana there in Netherlands and Spain, and we're starting to develop these readerships there, especially as Italy and Germany right now are talking about medical, and a U.S. territory that probably a majority of us have never heard of is also contemplating some sort of legalization, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So anybody know where that is? That's yeah, I did not.
It was interesting to hear about the reaction to the Reveal collaboration that you did. I'm curious, Ricardo, if there's any story of yours that people responded very strongly to that took you by surprise.
Well, oddly, we ended up running that full Reveal story as well, and it was such a great experience because, was it Shoshana? Mm-hmm. She just did an amazing job of reporting this harrowing story of what's happening in the single most important area of the world for marijuana, and that is the Emerald Triangle, Humboldt County. So that could be one of them. To this day, even though we published it, I think the day after, I think Cosmo and Reveal had it the first day, and then we took it the second day. It's still doing killer traffic. It really engaged audience. I think it's an important story that clearly needed to be told. But I think what also surprised me is just going back to how engaged this readership is. They care about what's happening on a city level. And it's not just Colorado readers. Denver voters, I mentioned public consumption earlier. You guys, many of you are tourists here. It's a problem. Have fun looking for anywhere to consume legally. How are you selling this product and then telling them, oh, by the way, the only place you can legally consume even an edible or a vaporizer is inside a private property, a home with that homeowner's permission. So it's a flawed system, and now Denver voters are voting in November on the first public consumption initiative of its kind. Certainly, it's built into certain parts of like the California law. They're tricking around with it in Alaska, trying to figure it out. But that story specifically is drawing readership from all over the country. Very passionate people who were following that. There was another ballot initiative that was going to be competing against it, and it turns out they didn't get enough signatures to make the ballot. But just some of these tiny news stories that you think might go unnoticed just catch wildfire because people care.
So I'm curious, I'm trying to get to the heart about, of why people care so much. I remember seeing this chart that Mike, formerly Policy Mike, but Mike had put out before the last election, and it was showing the conversation on Facebook around key issues, so gun control, abortion, immigration, and cannabis. And it was like cannabis was way over here, and the next issue was like down here, and they all sort of trickled down from there. It was just a huge spike. And so it's not just enough to say, oh, okay, it's just a polarizing or controversial issue. It's more than that. I mean, have you guys had conversations in your newsroom to try to get at the heart of why people feel so strongly about this?
It's just one of those issues. It's so of the moment. It's far from the most important issue that we're dealing with right now, but I remember when Vice interviewed Obama, I believe last year, and what's his name, Shane from Vice, he straight up said, we asked our readers what they wanted to most know about you, and that is, when is cannabis going to be federally legalized or regulated? And Obama was just kind of exasperated, and he's like, let's be real. This is not the most important issue facing, our country right now and our leadership, and he's come out widely and said that this is not a priority for his late term. Of course, we've had a big conversation around descheduling lately, and that was more of a FDA-DEA conversation, but I think that kind of gets to it, and it exasperates city leaders, it exasperates some of our editors, but if we're here to give our readers what they're interested in, this is certainly at the top of that, and it's inexplicable in some ways, but at the same time, when you look at the penetration of marijuana and our familiarity with it as a society, of course that deep penetration is in Northern California, but everywhere has this familiarity with it, whether you're talking about adults or teens. Teens, certainly. High use in Colorado. We're #1 in the country for teen use. Nothing that we're proud of, but when you talk to the head of the Colorado Department of Health, he tells you straight up, we have always had very high teen use numbers. This is nothing new. Ours are not changing. Others are going down, which thus now we're #1. We were #3 last year. So, you know, this is just a subject that people are passionate about, especially as we become more familiar with some of the criminal justice elements and the injustice elements of this very important conversation. You know, Jay-Z had a visual short film op-ed in the New York Times this morning that some of you have seen, and if not, go to the Cannabis. We reposted it. You know, New York Times, Jay-Z, important filmmakers. This is a very of-the-moment conversation.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly right, and I would just add to that, it's very personal, right? Like, there are people that have very passionate feelings about gun control who don't know anyone who's ever been shot. They've never been felt unsafe in any way around guns, but you know, weed is very personal, and I think the more educated we have all become about our criminal justice system and other things about big pharma, that adds to the outrage that we feel about certain elements of the issue because it's personal. Because, you know, someone like me would have a different experience if I was potentially caught with weed than some other people, and that seems ridiculous and unfair. And when you think about, you know, how many people's lives are affected negatively because of the stigma and the policing around cannabis, it just is like, it just infuriates people, I think, who do feel passionately about it, and you know, that's more people than I think we've ever thought that it is. Yeah.
I think that's a great point. I think that you know, thinking about it as a point of entry, which is that it's not just you don't have just to care about cannabis. If you care about criminal justice, you will eventually find your way to cannabis. If you care about business or health, you will. So that's actually a really, you know, I think you've solved this one.
I would also add briefly that this is a subject we all have also been lied to directly about, and now we live in an enlightened age where there's just a lot more information about that. You know, we're struggling as journalists now on how to cover this very complicated presidential election, you know, in terms of, oh, I don't want to reveal a bias or whatever it might be. And I struggled with that on this beat, too. In the early days, I didn't know how to come out and say, okay, were we lied to? Is marijuana safer than alcohol? You know, I was a Just Say No kid. I wore the DARE t-shirt throughout you know, elementary school. And when you realize things like John Ehrlichman finally fessing up in the 90s that Nixon and his administration made this shit up to go after their enemies, you know, and it sounds so insane, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. This happened. They wanted to go after the left, the anti-war left, and they wanted to go after the African Americans. And so they assigned 2 illegal substances to them. They severely criminalized these substances and let everything play out in the court of public theater on the 10 o'clock news. And so, you know, we're all part of this. And I hold every one of those teachers, parents, mentors accountable for ultimately spreading misinformation. And hopefully that's something we can do now, is just spread real information, so much of which is not known because we just don't know very much about the safety of cannabis, about the likelihood of how legalization is going to play out in our communities. We're just now getting the first bits and pieces of data from 2014 in a couple states, a little bit more, but all of these doctors and health departments and law enforcement agencies agree that we need 10, 15 years before we really know what this means.
So I think most people here want to know, as you know, it's called building successful niche digital media property. So, you know, how you guys make money. So I'm going to start with Sarah. What are the opportunities for revenue as a publication that lives on Facebook?
Yep. So one of our company's revenue streams is branded content. And while we haven't had a specific deal yet with a weed company, we've been working a lot more with like really big companies like Bud Light and Kleenex. We've had a lot of inbound interest. I think it's all very, you know, early stages, but a lot of that has to do with some advertising rules around Facebook. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes some of these cannabis businesses come to us with just a much smaller budget. But I think the interest is there. a lot more interest than I expected, considering the page has only been up for a little less than a year. And just knowing that more states are moving toward, additional opportunities. We know that the audience will grow in that respect. So I think it's still very early stages, but it's been really kind of incredible to just get completely cold emails from cannabis startups looking for advertising opportunities.
I want to talk a little bit, you sort of said the hurdles on Facebook. So I think there are people who maybe are not, unless you've tried to start a publication that has any presence on Facebook, you might not be familiar. So, when we were going live with Cannabis Wire, we couldn't even get the URL Cannabis Wire. It was, I think we had to launch with C Wire because they blocked us out for having the word cannabis. We couldn't promote our page, because Facebook sees this as it's a federally illegal substance, and so we're promoting a drug, essentially. And we really had to fight, and we eventually got facebook.com/Cannabis Wire. So how does that play into that sort of stuff? Whereas if you wanted to do branded content with a cannabis company, can you? Or would you have to be sly and sort of hint at the fact that it's cannabis?
I will say that's been an ongoing conversation because we haven't yet, as far as I know, been told no, and we haven't seen Facebook try to do anything negative in terms of our content, at least the editorial content. So I think it's a little bit of a question more on our side about the budgets of some of these advertisers, because we're a fairly small branded content team looking to some bigger deals. But it's something that we kind of we think about a lot, but haven't yet encountered in a really negative way. I mean, what you're describing is not great.
Yeah. And Ricardo, what about you? I know you guys have now branched off. You do events, you have merchandise, you have some listings on cannabis coupons. So talk a little bit about thought process behind those revenue streams.
You need to make money. This is a business, and getting back to the social stuff, that is really hard. We're 33 months old. We just got verified this week by Facebook. Absolutely brutal. We've never sponsored a post in that time, and it's affected our ability to grow. And so now we're ready to really make that push. But we do have a number of widgets. If you go to the site, there's a calendar widget, there's a deal widget, there's a map widget that's sponsored by Weed Maps, a California and Colorado-based company that is like a Yelp for weed, kind of the industry leader in that space. And so it works to our advantage for these vendors to provide a service to us and our readers, and also pay us to host their service on our site, in addition to hosting, vaporizer, weed shop, you name it, organic pesticide advertisements. It's also an interesting space because a lot of these companies can't advertise a lot of places, whether you're talking about live events or straight up online. You have to be able to prove that a certain percentage of your readership is over age 21 in Colorado to be able to accept marijuana advertising. But we have branched out, and we really, some of these ideas came from Newsgeist earlier this year. I don't know if any of you guys were there, but talking to a lot of good folks there. From awesome publications, it just led me to the place that I knew that we needed to be doing events, maybe a print quarterly counterpart, lots of conversations happening, as well as merch. This is a lifestyle. This is a story. This is journalism, but it's also a lifestyle, and we might as well take the best things that High Times has done, and they really have done branding well over the years. And so that Cannabis C is on a number of hats that you can buy for $35 a pop on the website. And we have 7 different t-shirts and hoodies and all that kind of stuff. It's all an important part of the pie, especially because this is a brand that we believe in. My editors are giving me their support and saying, we're going to support you as long as it's working. So I think the more holistic we can approach everything, the more we can actually invade our readers, our friends' homes, their lives. They follow us on Instagram, they have the hat, they bookmark us, they listen to the podcast or watch the show, they come to our events, they saw the documentary on Netflix, whatever it is. We want to be that to them, especially because our competitors in the space, High Times and Leafly, are investing tremendously. High Times is getting ready to open an office in LA with 8 new full-time hires in addition to what they already have in Midtown Manhattan. So it's just like newspapers, but just digital.
So I feel like I have to be the curmudgeon in the room and talk a little bit about the ethics of various revenue streams. So, you live in a state where it's legal, but coming from New York, I would say that it's fair to say that people are still split, right? Some might say, it's like wine, it's going to go like wine or alcohol, let's just go ahead and embrace it in that way, and whatever we can do with alcohol, we can do with this. And I do think there's another camp that's maybe a little more undecided. I'm undecided on this issue, where it's like, we're not there yet, maybe, and we are still having a national conversation, a national debate, and is it okay? And so our newsroom has never done advertising or anything like that because we don't know yet whether we feel like it's okay to go and take money from, or in some capacity from an industry we're reporting on. So, we're only grant supported for now. We're still guessing our way through this. I have a sense I'm a little old school, but I wanted to talk about, what are the conversations around that, or do you fall into it's like alcohol, let's treat it like alcohol camp?
We just simply fall into the camp that it's legal. As I said earlier, the Post didn't decide to legalize marijuana, I've never talked publicly about how I voted on Amendment 64 in 2012, and I'm not starting now, but this substance was legalized by a clear majority, a definitive majority of Colorado voters, so much so that it's now exactly like beer. You're 21, you can buy it. You're 18 with a medical card, you can buy it. And so we didn't make the decision to legalize it, but now that it is legal and it's in the Colorado State Constitution for recreational marijuana. So yeah, of course we're going to sell ads for it, and in the same way that the newspaper sells ads to the airlines and the beers that we cover.
Okay. And I wanted to just wrap up and say, and throw the conversation forward. I think right now, cannabis as a plant is sort of at a crossroads, right? As you were just saying, it's legal as a medicine in some states. It's legal like alcohol in other states. Some people compare it to tobacco, and now you've got big pharma coming in. I mean, there is a real tug of war over the future of this plant and what it's going to be, and I think that's up in the air. So where do you guys see the cannabis beat going? Where do you see it in 2020?
I mean, constantly elevating it, right? Like really getting it to a place where people that feel comfortable and have a lot of information already about this are being catered to with, deeper reporting or more high-level, cultural stories, but also just finding that entry point, because if, legalization and decriminalization continues across the country and the world, there will be more people, even if they're not consumers of cannabis or marijuana, they will be potentially interested in stories and information about this because it will be in their communities or, in the state next door. So I think it will become, I don't really like the word mainstream, but I do think it will become just less taboo and less stigmatized, to your point earlier.
And how often are you seeing cannabis in the pages of the New York and LA Times? The fact that the Center for Investigative Reporting did that massive piece that took her months to compile on this subject matter only shows that this needs more serious journalism in this space. There's tons of room. Please join us. And what's really exciting about the time to come is actually having data from which to operate, because we were operating in a vacuum for years, and now suddenly we're starting to get these early bits and pieces of data. Just last week, SAMHSA, the White House agency, Substance Abuse Mental Health, they released some more data. This is the third study in a row, 2 federal, 1 state in Colorado, saying that teen use is not increasing in the states that have legalized it. That's amazing. Colorado State Patrol data in 2015, earlier this year, we got it, and somehow stoned driving statistics actually went down, just by a couple. But from 2014 to 2015, they went down. I mean, nobody expected that. That's a massively interesting story. It tells us that money that the National Highway and Transportation Board is putting into education and local departments of transportation, it's working. It's educating people to be responsible And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't have the great data that we need yet, and now as that starts to come out of these early adopter states, it is thrilling and exciting because now voters can make a more educated vote in November. And in the next midterm, they'll be even more educated because we're going to have more data out of Washington and DC and Oregon and all of that, and it's only going to gather, and we're going to truly know what this means and what the impact is for our communities.
So I want to get into audience questions, but I wanted to ask real quick. I know when we were talking, Ricardo, you were saying you were kind of inspired by Now This Weed and how well the videos were performing and that you were thinking a little bit about distribution. And so I'm curious, and now you guys are only on Facebook but could essentially expand to other social platforms. So I want to hear a little bit about what you guys are thinking about as far as where your newsrooms are headed.
I'll happily start because what they do is genius when you think about it, and if we're not copying what they and others do very well, then we should seriously reconsider how we're doing it. I mean, social videos with the whole text and subtitles, because very few of us actually have the volume turned up. I mean, it is the future, at least in this one little space, and so we have started delving into that realm. We've always been video intensive ever since we started this show. My talk show is about 1.5 years old. We just recorded our 78th episode yesterday, which will go live tomorrow. But you know, now we have to start thinking of, okay, we have that great canna butter recipe up there that's really valuable. We hired a chef out of Oregon to compile it for us. She's written for 5 cannabis cookbooks, and we were the first to run her canna butter recipe. We really needed a video to go along with that, though, and now we're going back into all of our content. You know, we employ a lot of writers, a lot of freelancers and full-timers, so much good content to mine, and really they've been mining our content and others for so long, so why aren't we using our own content in a way that is actually communicating to people using social media? So we're just dropping experiments. Last week, if you go to our Facebook page, we threw one out about, is it ever legal to buy cannabis on Craigslist? The answer is no. I'll save you the 30 seconds, but we just made a little quick video. I wrote the script, we shot it, and we have a producer, my producer Vince, on the Cannabis Show, who is a wonderful visual storyteller. We're absolutely learning from them, and we're nowhere near the traffic they get, but I think it's important to at least go into that space, and then we can actually embed it. You know, we use Inform, we can embed it into that story, and that story always performs well, and now we have the video component too, and that can be sold, and it's just a whole different kind of thing, and the content is already there, which is so lovely.
Thank you for saying that. And we, you know, there's a lot of back and forth there because we have 3 producers who work on Now This Weed, and we pull from the cannabis a lot. We're primarily aggregators at this point, and what we do is, you know, take studies or articles and turn them into, you know, these fun social videos. And I think what we are thinking a lot about, especially as we enter 2017, is how can we do original stories and reporting, whether it's recipes or things we've always been curious about. Why do things work? Why does it work that way? And we can't find a great, you know, story, or we want to go to some of these farms and whatnot. We really want to begin to explore the story now that our audience has told us a little bit more about what they want to learn. You know, we've been listening for about a year. We have a good sense of some of the stories that they're curious about that aren't being covered. So that would be kind of, you know, as much as we love drawing on the cannabis, I think we will keep doing that, but we also want to, you know, try our own hand at it as well.
All right, so I'm going to get into questions now. I want to thank our panelists for their wisdom, and you guys now, I think, got the whole spread here. You know, we've got a subscription-based site all the way to a social distribution, and I think it's really exciting what we're going to see with the cannabis coverage. Okay, I see. I'm not sure who's going to be. Okay, Mike there. Let's start with you right there.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in Georgia, and I had a question more on going more off of the topic of streams of revenue. My question for the panel was, does the topic you're covering turn general advertisers on or off or showing ads to your site? How do you find advertisers who are willing to target the audience that you guys are curating to? How does that work?
I can speak to this just a little bit. You know, a lot of our advertisers are weed companies. They're plant touching. They're not plant touching. That's kind of a distinction. A lot of our advertisers have nothing to do with the industry, and they just want to take advantage of a site that's performing well and it's connecting with a readership. So we have a local burrito chain called Chipotle. You might have heard about it. We have another local burrito chain called Illegal Pete's. They have a location on the 16th Street Mall. It's delicious. And they advertise with us. Oddly, we had a car dealership advertise with us in the first year, which was a little bit mixed messaging, but that was their call. But this is increasingly a mainstream conversation. And more, I think we're starting to see non-420 companies come into the space. Also, I'm a huge fan of Breakdown, so
Yes.
love it. Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say specifically because we are kind of channel-based, we sort of have a channel based on all these different topics. So our advertisers usually come to us in the branded content space and usually are capitalizing on our main feed, which is the largest audience. But as I referenced earlier, we are sort of starting to get these nibbles from the 420 business community.
And I'm just going to jump in and say that I think people who are interested in doing branded content, there are companies that are willing to align themselves with this subject. So like Ben & Jerry's, every 420 does like some sort of a 420 related video. Virgin is another one. And I just think that I think in the next 5 years, it's not just going to be cannabis companies trying to reach this audience. It's going to be, as you said, they're young and male. So anyone who wants to reach young men will probably advertise on these sites.
If you were in Denver during 420 this year, you would have been inundated with tons of billboards and ads and pop-ups from Totino's,
Yeah.
the makers of pizza rolls.
Yep.
So, and just to follow up, all of you guys are badass journalists. Clearly, if you don't follow Breakdown, the AJC's podcast, subscribe. It's phenomenal. Your guys' court reporter is such a badass.
So good.
Please do.
Way in the back.
Hi, I'm Dave Beard from PRI. The question I had was, what if you could each come up with one single or one learning that strikes you in doing this for another niche publication? You say, oh, I have acquired this wisdom that would work in something else as well. So I very much appreciate the conversation so far too, so thank you.
You know, we had a conversation in the newsroom about the next phase of the cannabis, which we're now working on, and it's really exciting. Please stay tuned. But at another part of that, I think all this comes down to what's happening in your region, what's happening in your part of the world. Denver has always been this crazy oil and gas town since the 80s, and so I know that was on the table at one point. Do we want to create a niche publication specifically around oil and gas? Look at what the Boston Globe has done so successfully with the Catholic website, what's it called? Crux. Such an amazing job with that. They have a correspondent in the Vatican, geez, it's phenomenal. So I would just really look, our success is entirely due to us being here. This happened here. It surprised a lot of people that it happened in Colorado first. It didn't surprise Coloradans that it happened here first, but I would just look into your community and see what's unique about your community that really stands out, that's unique about it, especially industries, and just adapt from that, and especially what's happening that you're on the forefront of. And to be honest, a story like this doesn't come along very often. We all know that. This is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing, and I'm very fortunate to have fallen into it.
Yeah, you really have to just assess what issue or topic is your audience passionate about. We had a conversation in the newsroom when we wanted to launch a page for all of these videos that we had that were overperforming about like 3D printed hands and all these cool little tech products. And obviously the most obvious thought was NowThis tech, but then we realized that no one feels very passionately about just the word tech. So we called it NowThis Future, and it was about optimism and excitement, and all of the videos and all the content that we make kind of fits that vibe. So it's not the place for every single story about Apple or Android or Google or Facebook. It's actually a place for, future technology, exploring space, medical innovation. You know what I mean? So it's not something that a business side tends to come up with, right? Like, oh, there's an advertising opportunity and a hole we need to fill, so bucket all of this content here. It's something that actually comes from, people in editorial listening to their audience, reading between the lines and finding out what they actually care about.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think niche subjects really lend themselves to subscription-based models. I think that when you can really go deep and bring readers, really, as Sarah's been saying, elevated information that they care about, they know deeply, I think people are willing to pay for that. And I think that that's really niche topics, way more than general topics, lend themselves to that. Right here. Yeah, in the blue. Yes.
I work for a smallish JV in Oregon, and we come the hell out of marijuana, like everywhere from the state house to local land use laws to city council. Not necessarily the cultural aspect of it, but every news aspect we're deep in it. And it's really kind of a scattergun approach with multiple reporters contributing. We don't have a dedicated beat, and Ricardo specifically do. I'm just really curious if there's an advantage to having a dedicated marijuana specialist at a newspaper like mine, perhaps, versus spreading this coverage across multiple reporters on multiple desks and multiple sections.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, we succeed only because of the strength of our entire newsroom. But if you do have that one person, at least there's the clearinghouse of information. And so, our suburbs reporter comes over, hey, have we ever written about that? It's like, oh yeah, we did that last July. At least there's that one person, because you're so right. This story is all over the place. Especially when you bring some of the entertainment and culture and reviews, criticism aspects into it, it's spidering all over the place. And we've found, I think my colleagues are at least appreciative that they know they can always drop me an email. Our editorial page at the Post is very active on this issue, and we have a brand new editorial page editor who's writing more about it than our previous 2 or 3. And so it's just helpful for him to have my cell phone on speed dial, can call me anytime and say, okay, we're talking about potency because there's this proposed amendment wanting to limit the potency of not only marijuana flower, but concentrates, edibles, everything. What do we know about this conversation? What do we know about how realistic this is? Is this a dangerous threat? Are the opponents accurate in questioning this potent weed that's in many cases 5 times stronger than what our parents were smoking? So that's what we found, I think.
Way in the back.
So do your sub-brands run their own P&Ls? And would they survive as independent businesses?
We're not big enough yet for them all to have their own revenue streams, no. And also our largest audience is our main feed, so that's usually the biggest attraction for the brands that come to us for branded content.
I can say that the cannabis up until about 7 months ago was just 2 people on editorial. It was me and my colleague Alita, who's the best. And then about 7 months ago, we brought a GM on and a dedicated ad exec and an extra reporter and a part-time producer, and now we're talking about further hires. And really breaking the P&L for the cannabis out from the Post has allowed us to do a lot more than we could do beforehand, just because I think already the higher-ups saw what was happening, and they were like, hey, maybe we should show more attention to this, because at the time we had tens of ad execs on the floor who were supposed to be selling the cannabis, but they're also supposed to sell the music festival and the music blog and the main site and the Rockies bike ride and everything else, and it got lost. And so us getting our own dedicated personnel, including our own GM, who's sitting right here in the front row, Brad, who just started three weeks ago, it really has enabled us to grow in a way that I don't think we would have been able to grow if we were still on the Post's P&L.
All right, I think we have time for a couple more. Oh, sorry, I'm not. You guys are hidden by the podium. I'll start with you right up here and then you after. Or the other way around.
Participated in a PRSA discussion a while
Yeah,
back. I don't know if
good to see you.
remember that, but, it's kind of a local news question, and you touched on it. Do you feel in any way boxed in by being Colorado-centric, both either from an editorial standpoint or from a business standpoint? And how do you deal with that?
Sure, yeah, I never thought this was going to be a Colorado conversation. I knew that we were first to market, and that is worthwhile. We are still guiding this conversation from a regulatory aspect. But, this has always been a national/international conversation. I think the biggest hurdle was eventually getting the resources that we could start to cover outside of Colorado better, have freelancers all over the Pacific Northwest and on the East Coast. just hired a freelancer in Texas last week because we got the GA numbers saying Texans are our second biggest readership, and it's like, okay, we need to spend more attention to that. So, and the second biggest part of kind of growing from there was, where was this going? I forget where that was going, but total stoner move, I apologize. You know, I guess the second biggest part of that was actually, I know where I was going, having to convince the advertising section that we were not only aiming toward a local readership. And so sometimes they would see our Colorado numbers, which are super respectable, and they would be like, well, this dispensary group wants more readers. And I'm like, well, that's great, but you should be selling to the national pesticide brand and to the national grow light company and to all of these vaporizer companies that can sell their product across state lines. So after we got past that, I think now it's just off to the races.
Does it make you avoid covering Colorado-centric news, though? Do you then start to broaden your approach and get away from covering Colorado?
Sure, and that's where the newsroom really comes in, because we still have John Frank and John Murray and Joey Bunch in the State House, in the City Council, still covering those stories, and it's so simple for us then just to bring it over from denverpost.com, include it on the cannabis, and we're still covering this very important market, and it allows us to kind of, our minds to wander to Texas, to California, because you know, California already has a bigger medical marijuana market than we do, a recreational plus medical marijuana market. It's the biggest story on this beat. If Proposition 64 passes in November, you know, that is the true turning point. That is the true tipping point in this conversation. And then you have the entire west coast of the United States, plus, let's not forget Canada, introducing recreational legalization legislation next spring. That's huge. They're about to become the second country to legalize retail marijuana, and they're a big one, and they're neighbors. So yeah, I think if we're not focusing elsewhere, then we're going to miss out. And so I think it's massively important that our eyes are there.
I think, oh gosh, so many questions. I think we are out of time, though. I'm really sorry, but we'll be here. I want to say that I was reminded to tell you to please leave feedback about the panel, either on the ONA website or on the ONA app. And I want to thank you guys for being here, and I want to thank the panelists for all their insights.
Thanks for being here, guys.